Hello all, and welcome to the channel. So I know this is not the usual style in which I make videos, but you know what, I got a lot of things going on, so I am deciding to do it this way. So I wanted for a long time to do a video about the cult of Thecla, because the story is really amazing, and we did a reading of it on our channel. I'll have like one of those annotations in the top, in the corner of the video, so you can go to that playlist and see those videos where we actually do the full reading. It's really exciting stuff. But I did want to talk about the cult of Saint Thecla. So in the 4th through 7th centuries, primarily, Thecla was an incredibly influential saint. So she was viewed especially highly by ascetic women, but some married women did actually look up to her as well. So there you can see the image of Thecla. So while it was primarily female virgins that were the group that consisted of the cult of Thecla, men were actually part of it too. It doesn't seem like they slept in the same quarters, unlike the women, but they obviously were part of the group, and we will get to a few citations of some early church fathers that thought very highly of Thecla. So her site, her temple or maybe not temple per se, but her cult site in Egeria is actually a very popular place for pilgrimage. So we have an account from the 4th century, so this is in 384. Egeria, a woman from the 4th century, she's documenting her long pilgrimage to many holy sites. And she tells us that she's visiting the martyrium of Holy Thecla in Egeria. And the thing is, this isn't our only account of a pilgrimage to this shrine at Egeria. We have others. This is just one of them, probably our earliest, but there was already a tradition of pilgrimage to this holy site. So, big question. Who was Thecla, and why was she important? For this one, we kind of have to go back to the 2nd century CE with the Acts of Paul and Thecla. So it makes up one part of the Apocryphal Acts of Paul, which contains also the martyrdom of Paul, and 3rd Corinthians. Of course, in the Bible we only have 1st and 2nd Corinthians, but this also contained a 3rd Corinthians. So the work may have been part of a longer piece because it seems to kind of start in the middle of a story. However, there are multiple accounts of the Acts of Thecla. So there's, of course, the Acts of Paul and Thecla, which I just mentioned. There's also a Seleucid redaction used in Seleucia, and don't get that confused with the place of the same name in modern Iraq. But this one has a longer ending. It has another edition. There are some other ones that even include a different edition entirely, but in some translations they just include all those because they're really the bulk of the story. There's also the Life and Miracles of Thecla. This last one, it's a far later work, and it actually expands Thecla's pool of devotion and attributes miracle stories to her not found anywhere else, and it contains a very obvious ideological narrative for the origins of the cult. So I mentioned that the Acts of Thecla was originally part of the Acts of Paul, but it did soon become a separate text. It kind of became separated from the Acts of Paul, leading to that Seleucid redaction. And we know it was separated because it was read on its own. Egeria even notes that they read the whole Acts of Holy Thecla, but nothing about Paul. So let me start telling you about the story of Thecla in the Acts of Paul and Thecla, because it's really great stuff. So Paul is traveling to Iconium from Antioch. It kind of picks up where part of the narrative left off in Acts. He's joined by 2 people, Demas and Hermogenes, and they're visiting Onesiphorus, who he is meant to stay the night with. Now, importantly, these are all people mentioned in the Pastoral Epistles, so that's 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. So there's a strong link between those texts and this one, but I won't spend too much time on it at the moment. That study is for a later time, and it has been debated back and forth for quite a while. So back to the point, Onesiphorus, he had never seen Paul before, but he did get a description of him. He greets Paul, who, while in the text is actually described as being bald and having a long nose, just really unpleasant looking. Onesiphorus says, hey, I knew it was you by the fact that you were a blessed one of God. And Demas and Hermogenes look over to Onesiphorus and say, hey, did you, about us? Aren't we blessed ones of God? And Onesiphorus is like, nope. And they just go to his house. So they're not very happy about that. So while there, Paul begins preaching day and night. He continues to talk about how important it is to be chaste and pray. Enter the girl next door, Thecla. So she's to be wed to a guy named Thamyris, but she overhears Paul's preaching and sits at her window for 3 days, not speaking to anyone and even ignoring her own mother. She just stays in the window, listening to Paul, who, by the way, she can't see. She just hears his voice. So her mother sends her fiancé to go talk to her, but he can't get her to snap out of it either. So he goes next door and tries to talk to Paul. He's all like, you know what, because of you, the women aren't having sex with us, so you better cut that shit out. And he takes him to the governor for a trial, and he wants to send the magician, that's the word that they use for him, the magician, away. So the governor hears Paul out, and he says, you know what, I want to hear more about this later. So he sends him to stay the night in jail. So in one version here, Thecla goes looking for Paul, and she asks some local children where he is, because, as we all know, local children are very knowledgeable about the current location of prisoners. So she finds out that he's in jail and bribes the doorkeeper to go into his cell. He's locked in chains, and in both versions, she is said to be kissing his chains. She even rolls around in the place where Paul was preaching. Her fiancé goes looking for her and finds her in prison with Paul. And here's where the narrative really turns to Thecla. So both of them are actually brought by a mob to the tribunal, and Thecla was happy to go. She just wanted to be near Paul. So the governor, he loves what Paul has to say about Jesus, but then they start to question Thecla. Why don't you marry your fiancé? But she just stares at Paul the whole time, like she's just completely zoned out. So her own mother shouts, "Burn her! Burn the witch!" They don't say witch, but she does suggest that they burn her. So they set up a pyre just for that. What a legal process, am I right? Paul, however, is flogged and cast out of the city. But don't worry, there will be a crowd for the human burning. So with Paul away and her about to meet her death, she looks around for Paul, but she sees the Lord sitting there in the appearance of Paul. So this is Jesus, or God, however you want to interpret it, looking like Paul. But then he ascends to heaven. But the people light the fire. The flames, however, don't touch her. Instead, God sends basically a flash flood from the sky. There's a cloudburst of water, and it just floods the place, and a whole bunch of people are put in danger. But Thecla is saved and completely untouched. And that's kind of where it leaves off there, but we kind of jump over to Paul. So what's Paul doing at this point? So he got kicked out of the city, as is tradition. If you've read any of Paul's letters or Acts, he gets kicked out of a lot of places. So during this, Paul and Onesiphorus' whole family are fasting in an open tomb. Don't ask me why. Onesiphorus had given up all his earthly possessions to follow Paul, so they had no food. And they're probably actually doing it in the tomb because that's where a cult would be later, I think. That would be a holy site later, now that I think about it. But either way, they have no food. And the kids are hungry, so they go and try to buy some food. On the way, though, one of the kids finds Thecla, who's now just like in the marketplace. That's where she went after near death. She went to the marketplace. And he's like, hey, you know what? I can bring you over to Paul. And she joins the child to go to Paul. in this cave or in this tomb. I've seen both readings, but it says tomb in the Greek at least. So in this tomb, it says that there was a whole lot of love between everyone, but it's totally not sex, right? Because the Greek word that's used there is agape, which signifies a more brotherly kind of love, but they totally didn't have sex. Definitely not. So they leave to Antioch. And at Antioch, this totally nice guy, TM, named Alexander, who's actually the head of the provincial council, sees Thecla and actually tries to buy her from Paul, but Paul's like, she isn't even mine, I don't even know her. Now, the way that he's using know there is, the kind of biblical to know someone, to have sex with them, but that's not really mentioned in the text. It's just, I don't even know her sort of thing. But if that was the way that Alexander interpreted it, then this next part might make more sense, because he goes, yes, of course, perfect for sexual harassment then. So he grabs her, and but she starts to fight back and actually tears off his official garb, including his crown, and this causes everyone to start laughing at him. So he's really pissed off, and he goes to the governor, and because he's friends with the governor, he's able to pull some strings and get the go-ahead to send her off to the beasts. But because she wants to make sure no one tries to assault her again in the meantime, she's temporarily adopted, you could say, by a wealthy woman of the city named Tryphena, whose daughter had just died. So she was I think she was a widow as well, and her daughter had just died. Tryphena, by the way, was probably based on Queen Tryphena of Thrace, so probably a reference to a real person who later in life, from the few accounts that we have, kind of seems like she converted to Christianity, but that would have been very early on, maybe one of Paul's early converts. That's how early we're talking here. So almost immediately after, she's led away sitting on a lion, because only the best transportation for criminals, right? But the lion, while Thecla is sitting on it, just licks her feet, and the crowd is amazed that this lion has not attacked Thecla. So she goes home for the night. Tryphena's dead daughter actually appears to her, that being Tryphena, in a dream that night, and essentially asks Thecla to bless and give her eternal life. Thecla, the day before she is sent to the pit of beasts, has the ability to grant eternal life posthumously. Now that's very significant, and I'll hit on it later. But the next day, they go to the amphitheater, and Thecla is thrown into the midst of lionesses and bears. But somehow, the lionesses attack and kill the bears. Alexander can't believe this, so he sends in his own trusty lion, because the bears couldn't do it, so this one lion surely can. But the lion and the lioness actually kill each other. So now what do? They can't seem to thwart Thecla. So they send in all the other wild beasts. She lifts her hands and prays, and she looks around and sees a pit full of water and shouts, "Now is the time for me to be clean. I will baptize myself." Perfect timing, right? So she jumps into the water. But now, oh no, there are hungry seals who threaten to eat her. But fear not, there's a flash of lightning, and all the seals die. But that's not all. A cloud of fire surrounds her, so the beasts can't touch her. I want you to know that is almost verbatim what happens, and it happens almost just that quickly. All that stuff at once. So there is a fire tornado, and a bunch of seals die, and it surrounds her, and no one can touch her. So after seeing this fire tornado, Alexander has the perfect idea. He'll send in some bulls. I don't know how they get past the fire tornado, but they do, I guess. And his plan is to tie her to them so they can tear her apart, like a quartering almost. But to get them angry, they put burning irons under the bulls' dicks. But oh no, it backfires, and the fires burn the rope, and she's free. I swear, this is like a farce. Finally, after all this, Tryphena passes out. Alexander, however, believes that she died, and says, "Oh no, I have cursed the whole city, let the woman free." She, being Thecla, essentially says, "I am a slave of the living God. You can't defeat me." And she's set free. She then goes home and converts many of the slave women over the course of 8 days, but she still wants to see Paul. Lucky for her, she finds him, and he gives her the green light to go back home to Iconium and preach there. This is where versions actually begin to diverge. So in the Acts of Paul and Thecla that we have been going over, she's said to die here. But in the Seleucid version, she goes to Daphne after not being able to convert her mother, to the tomb where she found Paul and Onesiphorus. But when she leaves, she then goes to Seleucia. In the longer Seleucid version, it continues that she lived with a group of women and basically becomes the healer for the town. If the people have any ailment, they just seek out Thecla. Her healing powers are so strong that people are completely healed by the time they even reach her door. This actually pisses off the physicians of the city because her existence is basically bad for business. So they send many men to, and here is, I'm going to quote this, they send many men to debauch the virgin. I can't say the actual thing on YouTube. So when they arrive, Thecla opens the door, but since they don't recognize her, they ask, is Thecla home? We'd like to have sex with her. So bad. But she says, I may be very old now, but you will not be able to accomplish this evil thing you want to do. She then, of course, tells them to seek God, and she tries to pray. Then she, of course, hears a voice from heaven, but this voice tells her to go inside an open rock, which the voice, I guess, has split open this rock, and the voice is telling Thecla to go inside that rock. And she goes inside, and the rock just seamlessly closes up, as if it never had split in the first place. So in this text, she is said to have been 90 years old when she is, I guess, transported to a different realm. This, kind of similar to some ascension stories like Elijah, for example, or Enoch, where it doesn't say that they died, they ascended. This doesn't say that Thecla ascended, but she at least gets transported. It doesn't say in this version that she actually died. But either way, this entire story in the Seleucid version is very obviously a cult etiology, living with a bunch of women, having a healer, and then it gives you an etiological origin story for a holy site, that being perhaps this rock. Now, that was the Acts of Paul and Thecla, and honestly, it is one of my favorite stories in ancient literature. But from the story, there's actually a lot of really interesting cult motifs. We can learn a lot about this group of people when we take a closer look at the story. So, of course, number one, women-led baptism. This is a huge thing. So, usually, it was just up to the pastors, or at this point, it would have been, some other church authority. They would not have been called pastors yet exactly, but at the time that this is meant to be taking place, some church authority is meant to be doing this. Now, of course, in later years, at the time this was written, in the 2nd century, there probably would be pastors, but that's not the case in the narrative. So there's also the idea of blessing someone after their death. So this is very actually closely connected to this next point about martyrdom. So she's often viewed as the first female martyr, just like Stephen in Acts is viewed as the first male martyr. They're sometimes paired together in literature. And in the 2nd century, martyrs were seen as being able to make the dead living, at least according to Irenaeus. So this was contested by a lot of bishops who believed that this was their exclusive right. Same with the baptism deal. Not only could they be the only ones to bless you after death and make sure that you were alive in the afterlife, but they were also the ones to be able to confirm you into the faith. So this actually explains Tryphaena imploring Thecla on behalf of her dead daughter, who is named Falconilla, by the way. This is seen a lot during the New Prophecy movement, which is also called Montanism, with the martyrdom of Perpetua and Felicitas? I don't know how exactly to pronounce that, but we'll just leave it there. but they were ecstatic virgins, and they were given the ability to prophesy, but they were also given the ability to make the dead alive again in the afterlife with their blessing. The thing is, during the New Prophecy movement, a lot of Christians at the time believed that the age of prophecy was dead in general, especially after Jesus. So the only time that could ever happen again would be like the end times. So a lot of Christians had issues with Montanism. But Thecla did have some later appearances. So after her death and in her cult, there were a lot of accounts of people appearing to, or Thecla appearing to people and helping them in some way, or just being there with them. So, for example, in The Life and Miracles, in Miracle 46, in the same way that the Virgin Mary appears to devotees, Thecla actually appears in the bedroom of her followers and is actually embracing them while they sleep. In Miracle 12, she even saves the author of Life and Miracles from anthrax. There's also a 6th century story about Emperor Zeno, and according to Evagrius Scholasticus in his ecclesiastical history, in 475, Zeno was usurped, but he had a vision of Thecla telling him that he would return and take back his throne. Apparently that's exactly what he did, and he dedicated a large sanctuary at Seleucia in the region of Isauria. So it's unclear if this is meant to be the whole shrine at Isauria itself, or if it is just a part of it, a part of the complex. It's more likely to be part of the complex, because if this was supposed to be the whole thing, the whole church, it would be false, because we have accounts from before of people visiting it. But anyways, there's also the motif of the protection of fire and the animals. So to me, I haven't seen this noted by any other commentator. That reminds me of Daniel, by the way. When I first read this, I was immediately thought of Daniel. Now, of course, there are similarities to biblical figures like Susanna, Judith, Esther. There's also some similarities to Greco-Roman literature as well, especially the romances. There's also this idea that was very pertinent to not only the cult of Thecla, but the New Prophecy movement in general, and it's this idea of women being storytellers. So we get a few references to this in the biblical texts, for example. In the Pastoral Epistles, we have citations of old wives' tales and not listening to them, essentially, that they are just, they're just stories, they're just fables. We have a lot of accounts of that being like the main mode that women would teach each other. So in contrast to how men were supposed to be taught, women were taught through these kinds of stories instead of, having this academic and credentialed kind of way, at least through some ancient authors' eyes, right? But in their worldview, this was just an old wives' tale. That's just something that they told each other in secret. So there is a story from Apuleius, or there are stories from Apuleius, Strabo, Lucian, for example. They all have this motif of women being storytellers. So Apuleius, for example, in Metamorphosis, tells the story of an old woman comforting a younger one, saying, "Come, let me divert you with an old wives' tale, one that makes a pretty story." Strabo, in his Geography, very famous work, says that the great mass of women and common people cannot be induced by mere force of reason to devote themselves to piety, virtue, and honesty. Superstition must therefore be employed, and even this is insufficient without the aid of the marvelous and the terrible. So without these stories being both marvelous and terrible, you can't convince them of anything good, essentially. So we talk about Thecla a little bit outside of Seleucia. Now, of course, that was her big cult, and it definitely reached its height in the 5th and 6th centuries. But the cult spread to a whole lot of places. So it went to Italy, Gaul, Egypt, Cyprus. I mean, you name it, it was almost certainly there. And there are a few indications of this. So in Egypt, Athanasius, who was pivotal in the Christological controversy of the time, tells us that George of Cappadocia, he was a follower of Arius the heretic, launched a violent campaign and, quote, brought an increase of evils which they had taught him. For after Easter week, virgins were thrown into prison, bishops were led away in chains by soldiers, houses of orphans and widows were plundered, and their loaves taken away. The thing is, he doesn't stop there, right? So he continues. He actually says that one of George's commanders, quote, having lighted a pile, he placed certain virgins near the fire and endeavored to force them to say that they were of the Arian faith. So we have this kind of pressuring to convert. That's classic stuff. So I also did want to bring this up. So this is an image from the Chapel of the Exodus. So this is from the 5th century in Egypt. This is located in an ancient Christian necropolis, so it's a big grave site. So this entire, it's like shaped like a dome, right? And the art is a whole bunch of biblical scenes, like, of course, the Exodus, Adam and Eve in the garden, few others. I think there's some stuff from Jeremiah there. There's, in this picture, a procession of 7 virgins. There's actually an image of Thecla in the pyre that you can see as well, but that was probably a later addition, unfortunately. Yeah, just making sure you can see it on there behind my head, which you can, so perfect. So how was Thecla viewed in her time? So by some, she was viewed as an exemplary virgin martyr. This was especially true of the Cappadocian fathers. So Gregory of Nazianzus, Gregory of Nyssa, and then Basil of Caesarea, I think, was the last one. So in Methodius's Symposium, he calls her the chief among the choir of virgins. Gregory of Nazianzus says that Christ had saved Thecla from a tyrant's suitor and even more tyrannical mother, of course referencing the story. Gregory of Nyssa says that after her every fleshy thought and desire was quenched, her youthful folly was dead, and all that was alive in her was the Word. Now, I don't know if you know too much about Christianity, but that's a good thing. If all that's alive in you is the Word, and your youthful folly is dead, that's the shaving off of material things, this material world, and instead the Word is alive in you, that being the Logos. That's huge. There's also a story from Pseudo-Chrysostom, and this is a work in the name of Chrysostom, but it wasn't written by Chrysostom, and it was essentially a praise of Thecla, and it says that she was a pagan, but turned away from her family and material possessions. This is also echoed in the work of actual Chrysostom himself, where he describes how great her ascetic lifestyle is. But then, of course, she was viewed as bad by others. So this is a pretty well-known verse from Tertullian here, or passage from Tertullian. So while talking about who has the right to baptize, one of the issues that we get is that Thecla baptizes herself, right? And then in her cult, they are also baptizing each other. The women are baptizing each other. So while he's talking about who has the right to baptize, he claims that the Acts of Paul are actually fraudulent, and the man who wrote them was removed from office. He also says that, quote, "For how credible would it seem that he who has not permitted a woman even to learn with overboldness should give a female the power of teaching and of baptizing?" So, like, Tertullian is known to be quite sexist, so this is definitely in his character, but there is some debate as to whether or not this is authentic. I just wanted to point that out just for transparency's sake. There's also, of course, the many biblical references to the rejection of old wives' tales in the pastoral epistles, and women not being able to teach over a man, once again, in the pastoral epistles. And there's also a section in 1 Corinthians, but by a lot of scholars, that section is viewed as a later interpolation, primarily because that there were women going with Thecla, with Paul preaching, if you take Acts seriously. So if you take Acts seriously, then this wouldn't really make sense. But anyways, the pastoral epistles are very explicit on the fact that good women will be childbearing. So the ascetic life of Thecla would have been seen as a bad thing by those holding those to be authoritative texts. Now, as a side note, our earliest canon lists don't contain explicit references to the pastoral epistles, but they might be numbered among the 13 or 14 epistles of Paul. It changes from canon list to canon list, but a good amount of our canon lists don't contain these. However, during the 5th century, they seem to gain an overwhelming foothold. They're essentially in every single canon list after that. So, the role of women in the early church. So, of course, Paul, as I mentioned before, he traveled and preaches with women in Acts, for example, Priscilla. Significantly, though, women were generally looked down upon in church tradition. They were second class by nature. There's a very early work, the Gospel of Thomas, where Simon Peter says to Jesus, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." That's the Gospel of Thomas, 1:14. I think it's actually the last saying in the Gospel of Thomas. So women were often viewed as sinful by nature, so they had to shed that nature to become good, essentially spiritually becoming a man. This is actually seen in the writings of Hippolytus, he's writing against astrologers, but he uses the same kind of mentality to approach their issues with zodiac signs and the mixing of good and evil natures. So, as I mentioned before, the cult of Thecla is an extension of that new prophecy movement, and it was huge in Phrygia and Asia Minor. And this picture here is, of course, Hagia Thecla. This is Holy Thecla. This is her church. This is the Iconium one. And the incredible thing to me about Thecla is that she was a prime example of a part of women's piety in the early church, as virginity being part of women's piety in the early church. They had their own group that they could preach with and prophesy with concerning asceticism in general. And somehow over time, Thecla's character gained more power because, like in the story, she essentially gains superpowers. And it is very clear that by the end of it, they are her powers and not God's. And then in later stories, she starts appearing to people way after her death. She starts helping them in ways that really only a god or an angel could help. I mean, this was the essence of the cult of Thecla. And I think the story is really incredible. There's a lot of sexual undertones there, right? Because she can't have sex with Paul because she's a virgin, but she definitely wants to. Always looking at him and rolling around and kissing his chains. So this was fun. This was a lot of fun. And I hope you guys enjoyed this video. There's a lot more to cover about Thecla and the motifs in it, kind of what it tells us about women's piety, at least for those that wanted to stay virgins within Christianity. And there's a lot of interesting stuff about how men and even married women were included in this, but the bulk of it was virgin women. So I will leave it off there. I hope you have a wonderful day.